It's being started now. I'll stop the recording for now. It's being started now. I'll stop the recording for now.
Ready?
Hi, Hannah. How are
Okay.
you doing?
Good. How are you?
Okay. Today we're going to go into self-compassion and self-love because I noticed how important that is. Would you like to take over?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important because sometimes people can get stuck in loops in their head where either they're like unappreciative or ungrateful about the things around them, people around them, or a lot of times it's actually their relationship with themselves that gets reflected outwards. So I think that's pretty important to talk about.
Yes. To have the awareness and knowing actually is that, we our own actually projected out a world, and it's a very virtual, conceptual world, and which is that, it's looping of our own thoughts, but many of us not notice that, and then we are affected by other people's behavior. Some of that behavior could be self-centered, reflecting of that person's thought and that person's way of thinking, and actually really don't have anything to do with us. But then we emotionally gets, caught. Can you talk?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important well, it's like good when you can sort of zoom out and you can look at things. So things are not so personal and things are also like you can see yourself living in the way that you live and thinking the way that you think. And then the way that that self interacts with everybody else is very impersonal, right? Like it's just learning to accept that self.
Yes, yes. So understanding of the limited perspective of our own perception,
Right. Yeah.
way of looking at interpreting what other people say, interpreting of the world, right? That's a very, very unlimited view. Yeah. But of course is that by changing that perspective, by working on that broadening of that perspective, more objectively seeing the world, it will make a whole difference. And that's where, disciplined kind of like, have practice is very important.
Yeah. And like once we can build that compassion and like being able to objectively view things, that just automatically translates into everything else.
Yes. So why is that? Like, for example, is that, why a practice can broaden our perspective, energetic. I felt that, for example, getting into a routine practice, for over 3 years, and every day following that routine, doesn't matter what happened in the rest of the world, you just dedicated that to yourself. And I felt that that's one of the best self-love too. Like I asked some of the people, like, do you do self-care? And many of them, they immediately answer, yes, I do. When I feel down, I go on a vacation and I really, really have a wonderful time. Yes, that's one way, right? And that helps too, it probably can change, turn around of your perspective a little, but the thing is that, to really having a everlasting energetic shift, and for people that are depressed, to get out of depression, I think that a daily routine is so important, and it's one of the best self-loving too.
Yeah, and I think that there's a big difference between like there's methods of self-care, like okay, you can take a break from life, you can go on a vacation. But at that point, you're sort of escaping your reality, right? So it's the other side of self-care can be like you're getting to know yourself, you're getting to know your thoughts, you're really learning how to accept and live with yourself in reality. So I think that that's just, it's a tool that's much more like can be used to your benefit in your day-to-day life and dealing with daily stressors and everything. Whereas the other side is just, you're escaping it, right?
Well, one way of escaping it, right? Not a facing,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yes. And actually is that it's one of those things that you felt, temporarily you escaped, right?
Mhm.
But actually is that it always catch up with you,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I often say is that, we are not aware, actually every day our life, our work, is actually, is practicing us, Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but when we begin to develop a daily practice, then we begin to develop a self-awareness, and then we are not in that, passive kind of like a being, driving to craziness, right? Mhm.
Yeah, like we're just aware of what's actually happening and what's a lot of times we don't fully know what we're processing subconsciously, but when we're very aware of our thoughts and our lives on a day-to-day basis, we can sort of shorten the gap between now and when we're processing things.
Yes, so one is of sensing, like our senses, right? Immediately receive, we immediately receive reactions from other people, our emotions immediately react, right? So that's kind of like, like, so we have a perception. We have a perception, our reaction from the body, is going on. And then at the same time, we have a mental process, we mentally interpreting of everything. Sometimes, we turn that against us, when somebody was not appreciating us, we thought, okay, I'm going to work harder, and I'm going to work past midnight, But then what happened is that, still you're not appreciated, and then you become more destructive to yourself, and then yourself complain, yourself, criticizing, judgment, all of that kicks in. And that's, we are being driven, by the emotional mental process.
Right. And you can even like look at it in a much more physical sense. You can kind of tell how quickly you're processing things by noticing when you get sick or you fall into illness. You can sort of see what led up to it, right? Like retrospectively notice how events in your life, how quickly they became illness or sickness. And or if it took a really long time for it to become that, right? Like you can see how quickly your body and mind are processing things with that method, which is, interesting if that ever happens.
Yes, yes. I think that what happened is that for a lot of people is that actually is that the body is often already, has been for a long time reacting to certain situations, and then
That's what often happens. That's with a lot of people. But as you develop more sensitivity and you can process things faster, it will be almost instantaneous.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So then that's like when you don't have like the buildup in your body, right? Like,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Like for example, chronic illness very often is actually a buildup of
Yeah.
this wrong mental processing of happenings around us.
Well, it's just a very delayed processing. Yeah.
It delayed processing, but the body actually is that it's already being affected,
Hmm.
only just that we are not aware of it.
Yeah. So it's really great when people can develop the awareness and develop the, I mean, we were talking about before self-love, self-compassion. We
Mhm,
were maybe talking about that in a mind sense, but
mhm.
if we talk about that in a body sense, that really in the end benefits us and really aids longevity.
Yes, yes,
Because we need to learn how to um, understand and be sensitive to our bodies. That's probably the most important relationship we'll ever have in our life.
yes, yes. Yeah, so you are saying is that, we really need to learn. Can you repeat that again? Yeah.
I was saying that we really need to learn how to develop the sensitivity and awareness, and also that self-love, self-compassion for our bodies, because
Uh-huh.
it is the most important relationship in our life. Since if we don't have a body, we're not here, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. Mentally, of course, all of us understand, right? Sometimes, we even like a kind of like mistaken that, our life is only just this body. And then we are entangled, like, that, fixated, that on
Mhm.
this body,
Yeah,
right?
so it can flip and be the complete opposite.
Mhm.
But I do think that with now we have technology, we have a lot of things that separate us from our bodies and disembody us.
Mhm.
So it's a little less likely for people to be over fixated on the body than under at this point in time.
Yes, yes, yeah. Uh-huh. So that is self-awareness, the connection, right? The connection with our body, For example, is actually is that, like for example, I developed some kind of a sensitivity is that when I am, let's just say, talk to somebody and that person, is really very tight, you know, but actually it will reflect on me of my stomach having ache,
Hmm.
but through the daily practice, I developed, just like you are saying, is that my reaction in my thought immediately catch up. I immediately knowing, oh, okay, my stomach suddenly hurt, and this hurt actually is not mine.
Right.
I'm only just because talking to somebody and who was tight, right?
And
That's
that's like, yeah, and that's a big thing that people learn when they develop the relationship is just they learn what's theirs and what's not theirs.
uh-huh.
So some people are much more prone to having sensitivity to other people's pain and other people's energy. And
Mhm.
then when you're like that, it's even more important to develop an understanding of what belongs to you and getting to know your body and your mind in that way so that you don't have to be as affected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So today our focus is on self-love. So we are going to be more focused on is that, to have the awareness when you are in emotional stress, that how that have the awareness that knowing how is that stress, like affecting of the feeling of your body. And when you have a very, very long delayed mental process and awareness of the pain or not comfortable in certain area of the body, and that's throughout the time, it accumulates and it becomes illness of the body. So
Mhm.
we are going to be more focused on this part of the subject and how can we develop a good awareness, and also like a much quicker, awareness, mentally knowing, okay, my body is tightened up, I need to kind of like, let it go, or, not for other people's behavior and turn that against myself. Okay. So I'm gonna periodically stop the video so that I can easier, to. But anyhow, we are live stream of the whole conversation. So for people to listen to the whole conversation, they can go on and listen to the live stream. Yeah. So let's come back to this subject of how that we can set a good, way, what would be the best tool, right, to exercise self-love and passionately, loving of ourselves, because only when we able to passionately loving ourselves, then we able to love other people. When we don't have that ability, to love ourselves, we cannot love well of others.
Yeah. So I think that the best way to really develop the self-love and self-compassion over time is to have some sort of daily practice where you're checking in with yourself. So we can speak about this on two levels. We can speak about this on the mind level, and we can speak about this on the body level. At the mind level, checking in with yourself, noticing the things that you most likely have to process, current stressors, things you have to do, future things, past things, whatever's coming up, right? Having either a daily practice of like meditation or like I do a hypnosis meditation every night as I'm falling asleep in order to process the day. And also when we move into the body level, you can have some sort of yoga practice, breathwork practice. But when you're working with the body, I do believe that everybody's sort of self-love, self-compassion process most likely is going to start within the body, just because it is the closest thing to us that's like a physical substance. It's the easiest thing to work with. So I think that if you look at methods like somatic experiencing or anything that sort of has to do with that, the Rosen method, there are a lot of different sort of body experiencing methods. The whole reason that those things work is because you are experiencing the body, noticing inside of the body where things are happening, and just completely accepting them and being compassionate with them. Our body is extremely responsive to compassion and very, very unresponsive or negatively responsive to the opposite of compassion, to criticism, to, whatever may come up, or like, why are you like this? Why are you in pain like this? Why are you physically affected in some sort of way? So you can always start there. And oftentimes certain meditations and like yoga nidra, things like that will start there, where you're just noticing places in your body. So to start, just notice your response to those places in the body as you move through the entire body, right? And sometimes there can be a lot of stuff that comes up that's going to be negative or related to past traumas or things like that. And, can you sit with that and accept it and hold space for it? That's really where self-love and self-compassion come in.
I see. So accepting it and
exactly.
hold the space for it.
Yeah, and that also is the same with the mind. Thoughts come up, there are things that you need to process come up. Sometimes I personally get really frustrated if I'm still dealing with things from, over a decade ago, right? And like, why am I not over this yet? But I have to stop myself and be like, well, it's okay. Like, this isn't some sort of set timeline, right? Like, I don't need to set some sort of parameters around this. Like, it's going to take however long it takes to process something.
So yes, so not setting up like these mental restrictions, right? You know, and accepting of just let it naturally flow, right? Otherwise, is in many ways is that these mental restrictions, it just becomes self-judgment.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and self-judgment is it really impedes everything. Like when you're trying to work through things, right? To have the self-judgment coming at the back end of it is always going to be an impediment. It's always going to set you back in terms of just being able to approach everything. You don't want that automatic response to things. So when we can dismantle that just from its purest point in the body and the mind, you know, can I accept everything? Then we're actually dismantling a big piece of not having self-love or self-compassion.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so very often is that, you know, like it's sometimes, you know, we so difficult to catch these because sometimes, you know, from the societal pressure or whatever the way grow up, you know, you had these restrictions kind of like, you know, set in the head, you know. And then because of that, you know, and then when you are doing self-judgment, you're not even noticing, you know, that it's a limited perspective on the happening rather than actually, you know, is holistic, you know.
Right. And this is why, you know, a practice like meditation has proven so beneficial in studies and in, you know, in the world, just because it's really forcing you to become aware of every thought you're having, right? It's showing you who you actually think you are inside, right? What your thoughts are, what's going on, what your conditioning is. It's really, you know, even if you're not using it to the point of, you know, becoming enlightened or something, it really is just going to show you exactly what you need to see, exactly what you need to sort of dismantle about yourself and break down about yourself that's been limiting you in your life.
Yes, yes. That's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So in many ways, actually is that, you know, often we didn't have the awareness. What is going on is that, you know, like we have a perception that more or less coming from this self, you know, this self perspective, you know, things that, you know, we have learned, you know, and then, you know, is that, so we developed this self. So our life journey, it's more becoming, because actually whatever, everything that we interpret, everything that we see and how we interpret that, you know, it just, we are living in a virtual perception world, you know, and we are not actually living in a very objective world, you know, we are living. So the whole life journey, it really becomes of this kind of entanglement of this self and the natural way, the natural law, or you know, the Tao, you know.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, literally everything comes back to self-awareness. And self-awareness and being able to pick apart what thoughts you're having and what perspective you're having, and you know, being able to shift that is really what can enable people to be happier in this world.
Yes, right. So it really is that it's not any kind of a happening that is as happier. It rather
Yeah.
how we interpret, you know.
Yeah, everything is internal. When it comes to happiness, everything comes from inside of yourself. You know, none of it really comes from outside of yourself, because you could have the best world possible outside of yourself and see it like it's horrible and you're not going to be happy, right?
Yeah.
So it is all perspective.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. So that is why of through an actual, way to exercise self-love becomes very, very important. It's not like saying that, okay, having a good time, going on vacation is not important. It's rather is that it becomes essential, right?
Yeah.
So how to say is that, yes, so very often is that, we're stuck in our self-looping, but we are not realizing it. That's the key, so that the self-awareness becomes so important. And I think that actually most of us just from the meaning of the words, and we kind of know, of course, I want to, self-love myself, but to actually able to do that often is that, we could have, like a victimhood.
Yeah, victim mentality.
Yeah, victim mentality, and then because of the victim mentality is that we often interpreting of other people, whatever they say, we interpret them as that, oh, they are not accepting me. But actually is that, it could be, has nothing to do with you, whatever the other person say, that's from that person's perspective. It really
Right.
doesn't have anything to do with you, And then often, sometimes people, when they feel like they are being victimized, they get very angry,
Right.
It hurts.
And that's also when we come into like communication skills, because that that can be a big thing, right? In close relationships, if you're feeling some sort of way, then can you just communicate rather than sort of spinning out, having some sort of thought loop and acting on that instead, right?
Yes.
We can't read people's minds.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. When one of the things I think for somebody, let's say that, have this kind of feeling like being victimized all the time, right? And is to actually begin to aware that cannot depend on of other people,
Yeah.
to fill us up,
Right. Yeah. I think the most important thing is, if you find yourself like falling into that, is to really push for some sort of independence, like grow your own life, your own self, find what makes you personally fulfilled, because you're not going to find that anywhere else, right? That's going to all be within yourself. So when you have a victim mentality, it's really easy to fall into the world is making circumstances for you, right? Or people around you are making circumstances for you. But that's actually not true. You're probably just avoiding making circumstances for yourself,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So what happened is that, because that you have a, feeling being victimized all the time, so that the happenings around you gets interpreted in this kind of, in a tinted lens, of your, so then you see as if everything, that you are being victimized, And also is that the interesting thing is that sometimes, it's like as if, your head is thinking, oh my goodness, why, that, this guy just never appreciated me, right? But actually is that, later on, maybe through practice, you developed a lot of self-confidence, your perspective will begin to change. And then you're going to see that actually, the other person is just doing whatever the other person is doing, it's
Right.
not purposely kind of say, particularly, it's really not a personal, not particularly, victimize you.
And I think an important thing here is also like how a lot of this victim mentality stems from things that happened in your early life, like in your childhood, how you were conditioned. You might just have like blocks that you have to work through in terms of it's almost like you've had this set perspective of viewing things that you need to break down. And then you can sort of see things for, in a much more objective way and not as it's not everything is like a judgment or like a, it's all very neutral actually.
Yeah, not a personal, not really personally, victimize you.
Mm-hmm.
There's an emptiness behind it. So you mentioned
Right.
about, there's an energetic block. Can you elaborate
Yeah.
about that? Yeah.
Well, they can be any kind of blocks, mental, energetic. Um, Usually it really is just, either something happened, like it could be a one event, it could be perspective of your parents, it could be really anything you sort of picked up on
Mhm.
that shouldn't belong to you, that somehow has become a part of your identity and a part of your perspective
Mhm.
and the way that you view everything. So then everything is filtering through that lens. So you can sort of break down that block when you're in a parasympathetic state. You can change the neural pathway so that you can see more clearly, essentially. And that's really where meditation and things like that come into play.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that that is typically the biggest thing as to why people have a victim mentality, just because they're unaware of all the blocks that have come up surrounding that. And that's usually why they can't build the circumstances that they actually want to build
Mhm.
because they're sort of trapped in that lens.
Mm. Yes, yes, yes. Mhm. Mm. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper because I definitely, throughout my work, I have met, many of those circumstances, and but then when I begin to, really, really spend my time with the person and listening out the story, of the person probably has been repeating the story, in their head or with their friends and everybody, like forever in their life, right? But then when I listen very carefully to their story, then I find that actually is that even the story itself is that was filtered at that time, but then it lodged in a memory,
Hmm.
right? Like for example, I have met somebody, who thought that, her father was victimized by then of the political situation. But then when I listen very carefully of the story was that actually, he just had a very natural death from lung cancer, things like that. But somehow in the memory or the statement that in the person's head is not that. So
Hmm.
then,
Right.
so then, and then I look at the whole life, it carry out, based upon that assumption, and then, the whole life story goes around that story.
Hmm. Yeah. And I feel like that's pretty common, because memory is just so flexible.
Mhm.
Like we can really make memory whatever we want to, and our mind will do that no matter what. Every single time we think of a memory, it's most likely going to shift.
Mhm.
So in that case, I think, you know, breaking down how much your past really matters to you is
Mhm.
what's important.
Mhm.
Um, I think once you've processed your past in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
you should be able to live in the present without that affecting it, right?
Mhm.
No matter if you've already spent your whole life basing your life around a memory or something, like it doesn't really matter, right? Like it depends how much it's like affecting other people or something. Like it shouldn't matter that much, I guess. Like we're only human and we're just going through it. So in the end, is it like how much is it affecting you? I guess you just have to build some self-awareness to determine that.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think it's so important, people saying, let the past go, right?
Yeah.
But of course, is that in a lot of the cases is that, sometimes these head stories, they are itself is illusory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I want to get into of that for people who actually, really, really went through trauma, and, how can they be, really through self-love and bravely, let go of the past. And I want to go into that. Okay.
Yeah.
Hold on.
So
Yeah.
I wanted to say, I had a yoga teacher who would say if you're looking in your rear view mirror
Uh-huh.
and you feel bitter, then
Uh-huh.
you probably have to change where you're driving. And if you're looking in your rear view mirror and you feel grateful, then you're probably on the right path.
Ah.
So, like, really, how do you look at your past, right? How are you approaching things like that? And how you approach your present is usually very affected by how you feel about your past.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So my guess is that it's really is that what you said actually really is that, for some of the people who really actually went through trauma,
Hmm.
unfortunate trauma, right? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
Because by, like being defeated by that traumatic, event is not in any way helping you now and the future.
Yeah. And I think that moving through past serious trauma is very, very different for everybody. And I think that there are a lot of phases that you can go through with it. And I
Mhm.
don't think any of it is wrong. And I think that a lot of it, unfortunately, takes a lot of time.
Mhm.
So, you know, can you like how do you feel about your past trauma, right? Is sort of going to be the determiner of where you're at with it.
Mhm.
How you feel when you think about it or when you talk about it, how
Mhm.
much it actually is like presently affecting your brain.
Mhm.
And you'll be able to see kind of what your neural pathways are doing when you're talking about it or sharing it with people. I feel like that's a really big determiner
Mhm.
of sort of where you're at with it.
Mhm. Mhm. But I think in this case, really is that, it really need a very strong and probably needs to be built gradually, for that strong self-love and self-compassion.
Yeah. And I think that can take a long time. So it can become very frustrating for people.
Mhm.
Um, but it is entirely possible. I think a lot of healing with that kind of stuff, obviously, it also depends on what kind of trauma it was.
Mhm.
But physical, sexual trauma, you can really move a lot of that energy out through body work and body awareness and becoming compassionate with the body.
Mhm.
Mental trauma, I mean, all of it sits inside of the body, but mental trauma and things like that, that can be approached a little bit differently.
Mhm. 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 Yes. Yeah. Compared to most of the other people, like when I was in middle school, for 5 years, not being accepted into, the youth communist party, uh, because it lasted for 5 years. So that unacceptance, right? To me, it
Hmm.
trauma, but the thing is that still I was very young, was only between 11 and a 15-year-old, right? So actually later on, as you move on into adulthood, I kind of like actually totally forgot about the event, but it does not mean it's not affecting us, It
Right.
affected me dramatically because, and I didn't really realizing that, and then began to remember of the dramatic events every single year that I was experiencing during these 5 years. And I noticed was that when I was doing meditation and the teacher was asking us, to kind of like, like just, think about it that what kind of like childhood things stuck in your head, right? It was only through that I began to realizing, oh my God, suddenly there was this kind of like, sadness and everything comes up, the feeling comes up, and that connected me, for a long time. I couldn't really understand why certain situations, it just gets me angry,
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good example of like mental trauma and processing that, because from 11 to 15, I mean, your brain is really developing a perspective on how people respond to you. So when you're not being accepted, that's a huge factor that like you may never think about again, right? So
Yeah.
that's where it's different than like a bodily trauma, physical trauma, because it can be sort of locked away for a long time. And so you don't realize it's almost like that has affected so many neural pathways that it's invisible to you. So
Yeah,
you don't even notice you're acting in certain ways that are based around that past.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you can break down all the things that are sort of coming up, and this may seem burdensome or excessive, but when you can break all of that down that have stemmed from that block, from that perspective, from the trauma, right? Then, I mean, you really are limitless at that point, right? You can sort of mold your perspective entirely differently.
Yes, exactly. Because actually is that, before I connected, why certain situations gets me so angry easily.
Hmm.
Before I connected to that, I had a lot of, self-judgment, I was kind of like, well, why am I born with, a defective temper, right? I was
Hmm.
ashamed, and I was doing a lot of self-criticism and self-judgment. And because of that, of course, it affects of my behavior in every way, But I
Right.
didn't know why. But when I made that connection, it was a huge change, because I began to not feeling so ashamed of myself anymore, because I forgave myself, because this was just a total, like a circumstance, It's not like, I purposely did something bad or whatever. It was just a circumstance at that age of time, but it lasted so long for 5 years, right?
Hmm.
And every single year, right? And
Hmm.
so, and it was a total different shift of perspective of receiving of myself, And then of course, because that changed, then of course is that, it changed everything of my perspective of receiving of everything else that is happening,
Right. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. Especially because your trauma is rooted in not being accepted. You had a really hard time accepting yourself, right? So like you even took that onto yourself.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of ways that things like that affect us that we don't realize,
Uh-huh.
but it sounds like you did and you like did the work around it. So that's really great.
Yes. Actually, this is also partially is that, from my own personal experience, that I felt that to have, a routine of every day that we, it doesn't matter exactly which way that you use, you could use, a meditation, you can do a standing pose meditation, you can do like, a yoga, whatever it is that fits you, fits your schedule, develop routine. Because in my case, for example, like in this case, if it wasn't, the meditative activity, I would never able to connect that, because it totally, I forgot about it, after I went, into adulthood,
Right. Yeah. And that's very common for people to forget things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so how to say is that, self-love, self-compassion, it does not mean, like being self-centered. These two
hmm
huge differences. Can you like, elaborate a little on that? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that loving yourself and loving who you are, accepting who you are is really a basis for being happy as a human in this world.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that there's like a base level that we are
Mhm.
in terms of our personalities or whatever, like not all ego is bad necessarily. We just have certain tendencies that are can be interesting and you can learn to accept them and maybe love them
Mhm.
as you grow and you sort of break down everything that's blocking that, right?
Mhm.
Like when you're your best self, you imagine your best self, can you love that self and be compassionate with that self, right? And that's very different from being self-centered.
Mhm.
And, it's okay to be a little bit self-centered, I think, because I'm personally a little self-centered. Um, and I think that like it's okay as long as that doesn't affect other people in a negative way.
And for
And
others, that's the key, right? Yeah.
yeah, and humans are very naturally like self-centered, right? Like our world really does revolve around us.
Mhm.
So it is okay to have your universe revolve around you because, you are sort of the main character in this perspective, this movie that you're watching, right? We are really filtered by our own thoughts.
Mhm.
But right, it always comes back to how is that affecting things, right? Is that sort of getting in the way of you having the best circumstances for your life? Um, and if we like, let's say we just bring some science stuff into this really quickly, we know that like a lot of longevity can come from being around other people in our life and having love around us.
Mhm.
And oftentimes you get to the point of too much self-centeredness, right? And those people will not really be around anymore.
Mhm.
So if you really think about happiness and stuff, can you sort of mold your circumstances and mold your world so that you have all of the things that are necessary for optimal human life,
Yes.
uh, and just sort of playing with that. I feel like that's kind of my perspective on things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the self-love and self-acceptance is so important, because very often is that when you are not self-accepting yourself, very often is that you're not accepting others. And
Yeah.
most of the time when you are not accepting others, it's because you're not accepting yourself, Yeah.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I mean, I think we both used to be very critical people, and that always was because we were so hard on ourselves, and then it would come out on other people.
Yes.
So, and you don't really realize that a lot of the time,
Uh-huh.
that it is about yourself.
Yeah, yeah. So self-centered actually is that, definitely sometimes, we meet people who are very, very self-centered,
Mhm.
and their way of looking at everything, convenience and all of that. They always thought about that others are supposed to serve them, right?
Mhm.
Like in my work, I'm almost like 100% dedicated to serving others, For me, serving others is a joy. When I'm serving others, I feel I'm serving my own heart.
Yeah.
I happily, do all of the things to serve others, right?
Yeah, and I agree with that.
Yeah. But for the self-centered person is that what happened is that, they only think about what their needs are, right? And then they don't think about, that how inconvenient for others, that to spend extra, few hours just to drive around because they want someone else, to serve them and doing things for them or picking them up or whatever it is, right? And the issue is that, when it's being so self-centered and you're not thinking about, of others, very often is that it end up then, you become grumpy, you become grumpy of that other people are not serving you the way that you want them to serve you and all of that,
Right. Yeah. You have these sort of like unsaid expectations or, yeah, like I think everybody probably has at least one person in their life who's like that.
Yeah.
And it is hard to manage.
But that's okay. That's okay. Because you know why? Actually, is that when you self-love yourself enough, you have the confidence and you also have the compassion, and then you will not be affected by people like that anymore. Immediately you will know, okay, it doesn't matter how much effort that I make, the person is going to still not happy, but it's nothing personal. You are not.
And then you slowly usually start to drop that person out of your life, which is typically the result of being that way for the self-centered person. So
Yes.
It's not like they're not, hopefully not learning, right? Because they're going to notice this over time.
Well, at some point, they're going to notice.
Yeah.
So often I will say, oh, okay, the person just hasn't suffered enough. When the person suffer enough, he's going to begin to notice of his own, kind of like a self-destructive behavior, right? So
Right.
it doesn't need to bother you, you're still just doing whatever your heart calling you to do, right?
Yeah.
But of course, actually, as we practice more and more deeper, we actually come to realize is that we literally, energetically, we really don't have a self. We can actually separate ourselves from this whole, universal energy. We are being with it all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's a valuable tool to be able to zoom out like that and separate yourself. But in the end, we also just all are in our human lives dealing with things and responsibilities or whatever that bring us out of that. So learning how to cope with that too is very important. Like being able to hold everything all at once, can be very valuable.
Yes, yeah. I think is that, at some point it really is that, your heart becomes so still, you are not being swayed by the exterior happenings,
Yeah, and you have that, it's like a very internalized, embodied stability and foundation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think is that, when you're able to reach to that point is that then, you are in a state of really doesn't matter what is going on, you have a foundation and you're happy, you're confident, you're even tireless, you're not really so tired, boggled down by things, because when you have mental entanglement, right? That part actually exhausts the most of our energy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that, we have done such